Welcome, my friends, to a mini-series of Tea Time I'm calling Defense Against the Dark Narcs. While in the process of making videos about my transgender experience and putting them up in a public forum, I'm bound to be subject to a full range of human responses, and this series, for which this video is part, is dedicated to comments that I receive that make fantastic teaching tools on the toxic barriers and often narcissistic behavior that keeps us from making inter- and intrapersonal progress in life. Whether you're someone who has committed these toxic behaviors or someone who has suffered from them, my goal is to shine an analytical light on these everyday examples in the hopes that they become more visible and therefore easier to overcome in healthy ways. This first example that we're going to go over, I'll give you some background information, and I intend to, as much as I can, read verbatim what the responses are so that you can get a real feel for how the conversation flowed and make as accurate an assessment as you can. This individual commented on my video about Elliot Page, and that video was questioning whether or not Elliot was transgender. And this person didn't take too kindly to my questioning, so we'll start with reading their comment on that video. In that video, by the way, I broke down and analyzed Elliot's body language to lend potential support for the conclusion that I came to in that video. And that might give you a little bit more context so that you can understand this person's initial comment. So this person commented, "I think your analysis is totally off base. He is remembering the painful experience of getting out of the shower pre-top surgery, and that is why he is showing agitated body language and almost tearing up. You were right about the effects of testosterone here. His eyes are red, and I bet they burn, but the tears just won't come. For people who have a lot of deeply buried pain and have had very few people that they could trust to share it with, this is what it looks like when it comes out. You're not doing anyone any favors here with this video. Neither you nor I can tell anyone if they are transgender." So when somebody makes their initial comment, I personally make a gauge on how it is that I might best approach this person on a level that they're coming to me with. So sometimes I start my comments with a little bit more empathy, a little bit more softness, if I realize that they're coming to me with more heightened emotions, and that's just as a way to help diffuse the tension. However, this person seemed to be pretty assured of what they were saying and didn't seem to have too many heightened emotions buried within that response, so I assume that they're coming at the situation ready for a certain type of discourse. And in civil discourse at a certain level, aims to keep emotions out of it entirely and make very objective observations, and you also are pointing out any potential flaws in the other person's argument. So emotions really don't have a place there, because when you are pointing out that somebody may be incorrect, if you're easily offended, you have a large ego, you will take those points of somebody disagreeing with you as a personal attack, which immediately stops all progress on civil discourse at all. So I started my response with, "You started off your very first sentence really well with 'I think,' and I'll happily give you the kudos for communicating that what you said in that sentence was entirely opinion-based and not fact. And opinions can be good to share to get the ball rolling on discourse. However, in the very next sentence, you took the liberty of stating definitively, 'he is,' as if it were fact, when you have absolutely no idea what Elliot was thinking in that moment, and cannot state for certain because you were not in that brain. You can inference and say you may be wrong because it's possible that Elliot was thinking about XYZ, and then give evidence to support your theory. Instead, what you're doing here is projecting. If you want more info on what that looks like, please see the pinned comment thread. You double down on this projection and assume that the source of Elliot's clear distress is due to deeply buried pain and no one to share it with. And further, I'm guessing that you believe this pain is from actually being transgender and not just gender nonconforming and finally getting to rectify it with medical steps. You also have no way of objectively proving that, because again, you're not in Elliot's head. The point of me bringing this and more to your attention is that I painfully see you falling into logical fallacy and emotional traps that are blindsiding you and eventually will do damage. It's your life to live and lessons to learn. We all have them, but I have this channel not only to allow people to show me where I need to improve, but also hold a mirror to those commenting so that they have a chance to learn and grow too. And this often happens in conflict, sadly. Did you know that Elliot got top surgery with far less than a year on testosterone? Did you know that this is a violation of WPATH's standard of care, which is there to help prevent people from making harmful and hasty decisions that are irreversible? You say I'm not doing anyone any favors, but why should we only be concerned with helping transgender people and ignore all of the other people who pursued transgender changes and wrecked their body and minds? In defense of transgender rights, we're quite possibly throwing more people into the grinder than the number of people we're helping. And worse, the trans activists are crucifying anyone who detransitions because it harms their narrative, which is horrible. How is sacrificing one for the other loving in this case? Or do you not care for the ends justify the means? I'm transgender, and I'm grateful for being able to have gotten the intervention that I have, but I will never react in this fear-based narrative that silences valid questioning and opposition just so that I can get what I think or feel that I want. That line of thinking creates enemies and convinces no one to cooperate with you because it clearly demonstrates selfishness. Do you want to have peaceable cooperation with your opposition, or do you want to fight for it and create lingering resentment? That's exactly what's happening with this transgender agenda. People believe that the LGBT community is out to get them and their kids, and there is a ton of proof for it, where children are being taught gender studies in public schools without parental consent, and there are other examples. If you keep forcing your rights on people without concern for their peace, it leads nowhere positive. If you do not allow space for people to express their concern and dislike, and then have conversations to show empathy and respect, they won't give a rat about you, and the cycle continues. It takes courage to be vulnerable. It requires only blind rage and ignorance to put your head down, close your ears, and keep pushing forward. Barbaric and archaic tactics that achieve peace only as long as you can keep being the bully. And I'm going to go back and make sure that I point out some very specific things because it's important to note for the response that happens next. Language is extremely important here, so choosing your words very carefully and making sure that they are the most accurate and correct words per the definition is the only way that we can even begin to have conversation, because if you can't agree on the definitions of words, or if you're not using them properly, you've derailed the conversation before it even starts. So saying things like, I think, that indicates it's an opinion-based thing and that it's not fact. But as soon as you say that something is, that is a definitive statement, and that is a fact. It's not opinion anymore. So I made very clear to make that distinction between I think and something is earlier in my response. And as I pointed out, I'm bringing these things to this person's attention not in an attempt to indicate that I'm somehow upset with their original response, or in an attempt to tear them down or personally attack them in some way. Again, this is how mature public discourse happens, where somebody makes a point and then you counterpoint. There cannot be any emotions involved in here. That's just the way that discourse and debates go. The fact that I often lead off initially with something positive is a way to socially break the ice a little bit, because in a potentially social scenario versus just an outright public debate, you do want to take some social graces, some social courtesies, and extend niceties, I guess you could say, to the other person. Okay, so it's clear in this next response from this person that they're likely getting upset at this point. So they start off immediately with forcing my rights on people. If they are rights and I have to force them in order to maintain them, then so be it. I wasn't able to marry my wife until we had been together for 20 years, and the Supreme Court finally ruled our state couldn't prevent us anymore. So I'm beyond peaceful cooperation with my enemies. They do not peacefully cooperate with you, even though they may pretend to. You can be their quote-unquote good trans person, but you will still be hurt by the limits they put on us all. I'm 47 years old. I started transition at 40. Before that, I lived life as a lesbian in the American South. You seem to think I'm some kind of trans rights activist. I'm not. I have seen more than one TERF type saying Elliot Page is being trans for pay. So, seeing a trans guy say that based on his body language he's not trans, while misgendering him for no particular reason, was not something that I was going to pass by without comment. Should I have just asked you if you were playing for the radfem, gender-critical, TERF, sex is biological, whatever the good name for them side is? Okay, there's a lot to unpack there. Typically, you start a response to somebody else's response is by addressing the things, the points that they brought up, which is not at all what happened here. I brought up a good number of points about caring about other people that aren't transgender who end up getting pushed into some of these medical procedures, and that not being the best thing for them. And what about those people? Shouldn't we care about those people too? And this person skipped by my whole points about Elliot not receiving proper care, proper steps before having the transgender procedures and then coming out on a grand stage about that, and instead went straight to the thing that very clearly upset them, which was a portion of what I said, that you can't force your rights on people without consequence. So they said forcing my rights on people, if they are rights and I have to force them to maintain them, then so be it. Okay, I can understand very much the past of being bullied around by other people, especially in the American South, where it's not very LGBTQ friendly in general. It's very religious type people, which in the past at least, and to some degree still today, have not been very friendly to the LGBT community. So I get it. If you've suffered that kind of abuse and that kind of lack of basic human rights or basic human privileges as a result of that, you're probably going to be pretty bitter, and I can understand that. And it's very obvious that this person is off-letting some steam by giving me their backstory of all of that. 20 years married, or been together 20 years, couldn't get married until recently because of the law, only just now started transitioning because it's been acceptable for me. So they're, I can see now that a lot of people who fight what it is that I'm saying is because they think I finally got what I wanted, what made me feel good, and now there are people out there that are threatening it. I understand that. Really, I do. And that will create this very binary, oppressed, oppressor, good guy, bad guy, you're either with us or against us kind of thing. There's no middle ground. There's no nuance for these people because they're generally already on the defensive, and potentially rightfully so because of what they've suffered in the past, but they can't seem to move beyond that to find empathy for other people, and they see black and white. That's all they see. And furthermore, this person is very intent on ignoring any of the other points that I've brought up in the interest of just arguing with my perspective. So when this person saw someone like me giving that same rhetoric that they say they've seen with TERF types, it was quote unquote not something I was going to pass by without comment. So they're indicating to me that they want to punish the thing that they find wrong rather than coming into the conversation and addressing everything equally. It has everything to do with the fact that they were initially galvanized to comment because they felt very strongly about something. And that's normal. Usually people won't waste the time commenting unless something makes them feel very strongly one way or the other. Very clearly, this person is on the defensive and unable to see nuance because they're coming at me already ready for war. So my response to that was, if you've ever heard George Carlin, I think he said it best when he said that there is no such thing as rights. We have privileges, and they can be taken at any time. Of course, I support fighting for certain privileges because morally, some privileges are sound. I also never said to play fair with someone who is actively violating you. Neither did I say that you had to cooperate with an enemy. What I said was that you want to have peace with your opposition, not enemy. And further, that it's not good practice to make enemies of people who were previously neutral or even allied with you by attempting to insert yourself where it's a violation of those people's privileges. An example of this nuance would be fighting for civil union rights for homosexuals on one hand, and in the other demanding that it be called marriage, which is a word specifically associated with religious definition of union between a man and a woman. The latter is stepping on the original word and its sacredness in the religious context. If civil union and marriage are identical in the eyes of the law, the respectful thing to do is leave it at that to avoid creating enemies out of people who already do not see eye to eye with each other. It seems to me that you are hyper-focused on the oppressed-oppressor dynamic, to the point even of inferring things that I did not say, because you have a harbored hatred for the fact that you lived miserably before your transition and before you and your partner were recognized by the law. Yes, it's a terrible thing that homosexuals were not allowed to marry, but it's not okay for that hatred to be projected on anyone who questions the community, which is what you're doing to me here. It's a you versus me because I feel that you're threatening what I fought for kind of dynamic. The key here is that you feel I am threatening when literally all I'm doing is questioning. You may want to check out the video I did on troubles and considerations in questioning the transgender community. It addresses this defensiveness you are exemplifying here. I can further lend evidence to your frame of mind by the fact that you completely glossed over all the points I made in the last post without commenting on them at all, and went straight for the attack and espousing your victim status as justification for your behavior. And that's not civil discourse. I don't play sides. I search for objectivity and best possible outcome for the whole. Everyone gets scrutiny, and right now it would seem I am being harder on the LGBT community because we risk quickly losing what was so hard fought to gain if we continue twisting the dagger. And this person then responded. Clearly, you took offense at my initial comment. It wasn't meant to offend. I was giving my succinct opinion. Sentence 2 of my initial comment was projecting. Yes, that was my intention. Sentence 5 was not about Elliot per se, it was a general statement. And sentence 5 is supported and clarified by sentence 6. Neither you nor I can tell someone they are transgender. That isn't to say someone shouldn't see a therapist and give long, hard consideration before transitioning, but there is no blood test or MRI for it, as you know. After being condescending and then grading my paper like an English teacher, you went off on some kind of diluted rant in your first reply, which I mostly skimmed over rather than subject myself to your abuse. But you got me with forcing your rights phrase, because that phrase doesn't make sense, unless, as you say, George Carlin. Then you projected a bunch more crap on me in your second rant. I read some of your replies to other commenters, and they weren't anything like this. So I guess something I said or the way I said it just pissed you off. Goodbye. It was interesting. Quite frankly, guys, I can't make too much heads or tail of what this person was getting at. To admit that you know that you're projecting and that that was your point completely defeats your argument. She further goes on to say more things that I agree with, so I'm not really sure where the disagreement there is. Because nowhere in my video about Elliot did I say that definitively what I was claiming was true. It was all conjecture, and that's precisely what this person is also saying. So I don't understand where the disagreement is there. My response that I put up to that post pretty much breaks down everything else that needs to be said. So I reply, the fact that this person clearly indicates they've read other conversation between me and dissenters and recognizes my responses to them as different, but takes no responsibility for their hand in creating an outcome and instead labels it as my problem of overreacting, is troubling. That's a deflection tactic on their end, as well as gaslighting. There is no anger in my responses, only conjecture and observation. They also admit not to reading or responding to my points because they deem it abuse, further labeling the points as a condescending teacher dynamic. I assumed they would be able to handle pointing out their missteps, and I was wrong. They were not ready to participate in that level of discourse. Many of us, if not all, have been subjected to that very thing used as abuse, and I get it, not wanting to participate if abuse is indeed the occasion. However, if we can't learn to differentiate constructive criticism from abuse and dismiss it all, we will learn nothing and become the thing we suffered. It's also the same talking around the ego bush problem I bring up in Troubles and Considerations in Questioning the Trans Community. Further, if they deemed most of what I said to be abuse and refused to address it, they clearly have their mind made up that I am not respectable, so why continue to engage with that person? It's disrespectful of yourself to continue engaging with someone you feel is doing you harm. The only reason I can fathom is because it feels good to them to defend themselves and put the bad guy in their place. It's the oppressed-oppressor dynamic. It's not healthy, and sadly, it's what most of us know. Yes, I bring up some stern criticisms without much sugarcoating, and those showing the ability to listen, I'm happy to reciprocate. But this is what the original commenter is lacking. They came at me with, "You are not going to get away with that on my watch," rather than curiosity. I'm not everyone's cup of tea, and I'll be the first to admit that sweetness just isn't my strength. I'm here for the tough conversations to get better as a person. For people like the original commenter who display this much guardedness, inability to listen, and ad hominem attacks, it's best not to further engage and let them on their path. And that's perfectly alright. I wish them well. So as I mentioned, a lot of what they are doing are tactics of narcissism, which are deflecting and gaslighting, which is to say that they claim that I must be the one with the problem if I'm responding to them differently than all the other commenters that they saw I've engaged with where there's been a healthier back and forth conversation. Instead of thinking that it had anything to do with their behavior, they went straight for, well, you must be the problem, I must have pissed you off in some way, and therefore you have a rage problem to keep in check, not me. So that's gaslighting and deflection. And again, instead of reading what I had to say and addressing those points, they brush it off as just TLDR, nothing to see here because it's just abuse, and then further label the back and forth as the oppressed-oppressor, superior, inferior, teacher-student kind of dynamic, when again, in discourse, that's what you do. You grade the other person, they grade you back, and you go back and forth until it's deemed that the best appropriate solution has come out of the back and forth. And something else that's in there, as I pointed out, that if they thought that I was just abusing them, it's very disrespectful to yourself to continue to engage with somebody that you've already dismissed as being an abusive person. The healthiest thing for you to do is to just walk away. Don't engage in any of that behavior. But as I said, on some level, this person takes some kind of joy and delight in that, whether it's that they have an addiction to being angry, or they just like to defend themselves against other people. They like to punish other people for what they deem as incorrect or unhelpful things that are being said, but they have no willingness to turn the lens back on themselves and be subjected to that kind of scrutiny. Alright, so what are the takeaways of this conversation? The first, I would say, is that anytime you're going to engage with somebody, you should ask yourself a few questions first. The first one being that is it really worth engaging? And to determine that, find out what your motivations are in engaging that person. If you find that your emotions are in the way and you're engaging that person as a way to be punishing, or you're upset about something and so you want to gain some kind of retribution for that, likely the situation is not going to end very well. Think about what you want the end result of that interaction to be. And hopefully, most of the time, you want it to be a positive one. So, coming at somebody with a frame of mind that's emotionally loaded and wanting to call someone out or punish is not the best frame of mind to enter a civil conversation. Secondly, it'd be a really good idea to make sure that you choose your language very, very carefully. Again, so that you can make sure that you are communicating very clearly and that there can't be any misconceptions in getting your point across. If it's a situation where you don't respect that person enough to listen to the counterpoints that they might make, again, it's really not wise to engage in that situation at all, because if that person is indeed not respectable, you're not doing yourself any favors in engaging with a toxic or abusive person. However, if you think that person is worthy of engaging with, it would be a good idea to prep yourself first to be able to listen to whatever counterpoints they may have, because you can learn something from that. It's also a really good idea to clear up any lingering biases that you have about the oppressed oppressor dynamic, as in you're always looking at somebody else as someone who is out to hurt you, out to get you, and that you have to get them first. I understand that that's a dynamic that a lot of people live with here, but if we're going to get any better, we have to learn to recognize where those situations are occurring and refrain from contributing to those situations, learn to walk away, and only engage where it's going to be respectful and fruitful. And not to lump everybody into categories, either you are for me or against me, and be unable to listen to the nuanced details within that conversation. Learning to recognize which situations are truly toxic and which situations that exercising a little bit of humility would go a long way to both helping yourself grow and making headway in that conversation is a very good skill to have.